The boardroom of Carter Biotech had once echoed with applause every time Evelyn Carter walked in. At just 38, she had transformed her father's struggling pharmaceutical company into a global empire worth billions. Investors admired her brilliance, employees respected her discipline, and newspapers called her the woman who could solve any problem with science. Then everything changed. It started with something so small that no one took it seriously. During an important meeting, Evelyn's right hand trembled just enough for her pen to slip onto the conference table. She laughed it off, blaming too much coffee and too little sleep. Her executives smiled politely, and the meeting continued. Over the next few weeks, strange symptoms appeared one after another. Her fingers occasionally went numb. She felt exhausted after climbing a single flight of stairs. Some mornings, her vision blurred for a few seconds before returning to normal. Every specialist she visited offered a different opinion, but none could explain why her body was slowly failing. Money was never an obstacle. She traveled to the finest hospitals in America, Europe, and Japan. World-renowned neurologists, immunologists, and genetic experts examined her around the clock. Private laboratories ran experimental tests that most patients could never afford. She funded cutting-edge research programs and even offered a $100 million reward to any medical team that could identify and cure her illness. Months passed. The reward attracted the brightest minds in medicine, yet every promising treatment ended in disappointment. Some medications caused dangerous side effects. Others worked for only a few days before her condition worsened again. As Evelyn grew weaker, she stopped appearing in public. Board meetings were moved to her private medical suite overlooking the city skyline. Nurses, physicians, and security staff filled the once peaceful floor. One afternoon, while another famous specialist adjusted her IV line before discussing yet another expensive treatment, a quiet janitor pushing a cleaning cart paused outside the room. A widowed single father who had spent years caring for his chronically ill daughter noticed something everyone else had ignored. It wasn't the trembling. It wasn't the fatigue. It was a tiny, unusual change in Evelyn's left hand that made him quietly whisper to himself, "Something isn't right." Marcus Hill lowered his mop and looked through the partially open hospital room door for only a second before continuing his work. He had cleaned the executive medical floor every evening for almost 4 years. Most patients barely noticed him, and that never bothered him. His job was to keep the hallways spotless, not to interrupt doctors. Still, something about Evelyn Carter caught his attention. The physicians were focused on discussing blood reports and expensive medications, but Marcus noticed the faint bluish color around the tips of her left fingers. More importantly, her wedding ring looked unusually tight, even though the rest of her hand appeared thinner than before. He quietly remembered seeing the same combination years earlier. His wife, Angela, had suffered from a rare autoimmune disease before she passed away. During her illness, Marcus had attended every appointment, listened carefully to every specialist, and learned to recognize small physical changes that even experienced doctors sometimes overlooked. Later, when his young daughter developed a different chronic condition, he became even more observant. After finishing the hallway, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about Evelyn's hand. The next afternoon, he saw her again while replacing a trash bag outside her room. As a nurse adjusted the blanket, Evelyn briefly rubbed her fingers and winced as if they hurt. Marcus politely spoke to the nurse. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Has anyone looked at the circulation in her hands? The swelling around that ring doesn't seem normal." The nurse smiled kindly but dismissed the comment. "The doctors have already checked everything," she replied. "This case has been reviewed by specialists from all over the world." Marcus nodded respectfully and returned to work. He understood why she didn't take his observations seriously. He wasn't a doctor. He was simply the janitor. But the feeling wouldn't leave him. That evening, he searched through the old notebook where he had written details from Angela's treatments years ago. One page described an uncommon symptom involving painful fingers, temporary numbness, and restricted blood flow before other test results became obvious. The description sounded remarkably familiar. Marcus closed the notebook, stared at the page for several seconds, and wondered whether speaking up again would make any difference, or simply cost him the job he desperately needed to support his daughter. Marcus barely slept that night. The notebook on his kitchen table stayed open while he replayed every detail he had noticed about Evelyn Carter. He knew he could be wrong. He also knew that staying silent would bother him far more than speaking up. The next morning, he arrived at the medical center earlier than usual. Before beginning his cleaning rounds, he asked the charge nurse if he could have 2 minutes with the physician overseeing Evelyn's care. The request was met with surprise. "A janitor wants to discuss a patient's condition?" one staff member asked. Marcus remained calm. "I understand how it sounds. I'm not trying to diagnose anyone. I only want to share an observation." Perhaps because he was respectful and persistent, the attending physician finally agreed to listen. Marcus explained that years earlier, his late wife had shown similar changes in her fingers before doctors discovered a rare autoimmune disorder affecting her blood vessels. He emphasized that Evelyn's symptoms reminded him of those early warning signs. "Maybe it has nothing to do with her illness," he admitted. "But if no one has specifically looked into it, it might be worth considering." The physician thanked him politely, though Marcus could tell he remained skeptical. Later that afternoon, however, the medical team reviewed Evelyn's records once more. One younger specialist mentioned that several of her previous blood tests contained subtle abnormalities that had never seemed significant on their own. Combined with Marcus's observation, they decided to order additional vascular imaging and a more specialized autoimmune panel. Within 2 days, the new results revealed something unexpected. Evelyn wasn't suffering from an untreatable mystery disease after all. She had an extremely rare autoimmune condition that was restricting blood flow to small vessels throughout her body. It was uncommon enough that most physicians would never encounter a case during their careers, and its early symptoms often resembled dozens of other illnesses. The treatment wasn't simple, but for the first time in nearly 2 years, her doctors had a diagnosis they could confidently explain. When Evelyn learned that the breakthrough began with a janitor's quiet observation, she asked only one question: "Can I meet the man who refused to ignore what everyone else missed?" Evelyn Carter expected to meet an experienced physician or a medical researcher whose work had finally uncovered the truth. Instead, the nurse led a quietly dressed janitor into her room. He looked uncomfortable standing beside the hospital bed, still wearing his work uniform and holding his cap in his hands. "You wanted to see me?" Marcus asked gently. Evelyn smiled for the first time in weeks. "They told me the new tests were ordered because of something you noticed," she said. "You may have saved my life." Marcus shook his head. "I didn't save anyone. I only mentioned something that reminded me of my wife. The doctors are the ones who found the answer." His humility surprised everyone in the room. As Evelyn recovered over the following months, the treatment gradually restored her strength. The numbness in her hands became less frequent, her energy returned, and she was finally able to leave the hospital after nearly 7 months. Before returning to work, she asked her executive team to learn more about Marcus. She discovered that after losing his wife, he had raised his 10-year-old daughter, Lily, alone. Between hospital visits for his daughter and working long night shifts, he had never complained. Every paycheck went toward rent, groceries, and medical expenses. Evelyn invited Marcus and Lily to lunch at the company headquarters. "I can't repay what you did," she told him, "but I can make sure kindness like yours is never overlooked." She established a foundation that provided financial assistance to single parents caring for children with serious illnesses. Instead of naming it after herself, she insisted it be called the Hill Family Care Fund, honoring Marcus and the compassion that had inspired it. Marcus was also offered a new position as a patient experience coordinator, helping hospital staff recognize concerns raised by patients and families. He accepted after careful thought, knowing his experiences might help others. Months later, Evelyn stood before employees at the company's annual meeting. "I spent millions searching for the right answer," she said. "What finally changed my life wasn't money. It was a person who cared enough to pay attention." The audience rose in applause, while Marcus, standing quietly at the back beside his daughter, wished the attention would end. He had never wanted recognition. He had only wanted someone to listen before it was too late.